Part 1. The First Step. The Carter mansion stood quietly atop a snow-covered hill, surrounded by bare trees amidst the harsh winter. It was a grand structure, yet it exuded an eerie coldness, as if time had stopped in every corner of the place. The icy wind howled through the large glass windows, carrying with it the breath of solitude. Lila Lane tightened the wool scarf around her neck as she stepped through the large iron gate. She looked up at the massive house before her, feeling the heavy atmosphere that enveloped it. Hired as a nurse to care for Robert Carter, a wealthy billionaire in a vegetative state, Lila couldn't help but feel curious about this family's life. Although she had worked for many prestigious families before, the Carter mansion seemed to have a different tone, cold, empty, and full of mystery. When the mansion's large door opened, Lila was greeted by the family's butler, Mr. Martin, an older man with a stern yet polite gaze. He led her through long marble hallways where her footsteps echoed in the eerily quiet space. Lila had just stepped into the spacious living room when David Carter appeared. He stood by the large window, hands in his pockets, gazing out over the snow-covered courtyard. David Carter, Robert's only son, was the one who had personally hired Lila. But upon meeting him, Lila realized that he held no hope for his father's recovery. David was tall and exuded a tough exterior, but his eyes held a sadness he couldn't hide. His face was cold, his gaze sharp, and David projected such an air of distance that Lila could clearly sense the emotional walls he had built around himself. "You're the new nurse?" David's deep voice broke the silence, yet he didn't turn to look at Lila. "Yes, I'm Lila Lane," she replied, maintaining professionalism in her tone. David gave a slight nod and turned to face her. Under the soft yellow light, Lila noticed faint dark circles under his eyes, signs of countless sleepless nights. "I'm busy, and all I need is for you to take good care of my father," David said bluntly, his voice devoid of warmth. "But if you think you can change anything, go ahead and try." David's words caught Lila off guard, but instead of feeling uncomfortable, she sensed that beneath his cold exterior was a man carrying deep, hidden pain. "I understand," Lila responded gently, "but I believe that regardless of his condition, the presence of family is still important." David smirked, though there was no warmth in it. He simply nodded and left the room without saying another word. Lila's work officially began the following morning. She spent most of her time in Mr. Roberts' quiet room, a large space with windows overlooking the snow-covered garden. Robert lay on a large bed, his face marked by the passage of time, yet still bearing the commanding presence of someone who once ruled an empire. The machine surrounding him maintained his fragile connection to life, and Lila silently carried out her duties, checking his health, massaging his muscles to prevent atrophy, and talking to him each day, even though she never received a response. Every time Lila left the room, she noticed David watching from a distance, though he never once stepped inside. One day, Lila decided to ask him, "Would you like to visit your father?" David simply shook his head, his voice indifferent. "He doesn't need me there." Lila didn't press further, but she understood that the relationship between David and his father was far from ordinary. Each evening, as Lila left Robert's room, the long, dark hallways of the mansion made her acutely aware of the place's coldness. The house showed no signs of life or joy. The family portraits on the walls were faded, as if every happy memory had been frozen in time. David often sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes staring blankly at the flickering flames in the fireplace. Though they lived under the same roof, there was an ocean of distance between David and his father. Lila couldn't help but wonder what had driven them so far apart. Welcome to today's story. Don't forget to hit follow to stay updated with meaningful daily stories. Leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. Who knows, we might connect with others who enjoy stories just like you from around the world. Part 2. Buried Secrets. The Carter mansion, despite its grandeur, carried an unsettling silence. As the days passed, Lila gradually realized that this quietness stemmed not only from Robert lying motionless in his bed, but also from the long-standing rift between father and son. Lila noticed that David and Robert hadn't spoken to each other for a long time, even before Robert fell ill. This became more apparent through stories shared by Martin, the butler, during the rare afternoons they had the chance to converse. Mr. David hasn't stepped into Mr. Carter's room since Mrs. Evelyn passed away, Martin said, his voice lowering. They live under the same roof but are like strangers. Lila remained silent, continuing to brew tea for Martin in the kitchen. And Mr. Robert, Lila asked softly, her eyes glancing toward the hallway leading to Robert's room. Martin sighed quietly. Mr. Carter has always left David's door open, but he's never once walked in. Each day, Lila saw David pass by his father's door without stopping. At times, she felt he deliberately avoided his father's gaze, even though Robert couldn't see him. Once Lila asked, "Don't you want to visit Mr. Robert?" David stood still for a long moment, then turned away. His voice was soft but cold. "He doesn't need me, and I don't need him." One afternoon, Lila decided to clean Robert's study, a large room tucked away in the far corner of the mansion, untouched since his illness. The room was covered in dust, with dim light filtering through the curtains, giving it the feeling of stepping into a forgotten world where time had stopped. She carefully dusted the dark wooden shelves and organized old books. While pulling open a drawer in the desk, Lila found a yellowed envelope. On the outside, it simply read, "To David." She hesitated for a few seconds before deciding to open it. The paper inside bore Robert's trembling handwriting, as if written during a moment of overwhelming emotion. "David, my son, I know you don't want to see me anymore. I understand why, but that doesn't lessen my regret. Your mother left us because of a mistake I made. I let her go in anger, and I can never forgive myself for that. You have every right to resent me, but you must know that I never stopped loving your mother. And you. No matter what, I've always hoped you would come back." Lila's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading the letter. It had never been sent, left silently in the drawer like the pain Robert had buried within himself for so many years. She sat quietly for a long time, thinking about David. His eyes, cold as they seemed, sometimes flickered with sadness, as if he was also waiting for something from his father. That evening, Lila sought out Martin to learn more about the Carter family's past. Under the warm yellow light of the kitchen, Martin recounted the story few people truly knew. "Mrs. Evelyn was a wonderful woman," Martin began, his eyes distant as if gazing into the past. "But there were always disagreements between her and Mr. Carter. She left the mansion a few times after big arguments, but the last time, she never came back." Lila furrowed her brows slightly. "An accident?" she asked quietly. Martin nodded. "That night they argued about the family business. Mrs. Evelyn wanted Mr. Carter to spend more time with David, but he was too consumed with work. She left late at night, and just a few hours later, the accident happened on the forest road. David was the first to hear the news." The kitchen fell into silence. Lila could imagine the pain David must have endured, losing his mother while the father he once admired indirectly caused the tragedy. "Since then, David never forgave Mr. Robert," Martin added softly. "I think he still carries that resentment, but at the same time, he's afraid of losing his father." Lila began to understand why David always watched from a distance, but never approached his father. It wasn't indifference, it was fear of being hurt once more. Returning to Robert's room, Lila sat beside his bed, gently placing her hand over his cold, aged one. She whispered softly, "Mr. Robert, David is still here, but perhaps you need to speak first." Outside the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the Carter mansion in silence. But somewhere within the house, Lila believed the frozen walls were beginning to thaw. Part 3. The First Conversation. The Carter mansion lay in silence as night descended, with only the sound of wind whistling through the windows and the faint glow from the table lamp in the living room. Lila entered carrying a tray of hot tea. She knew David often sat there alone at this hour, staring into the fire, as if reliving a memory that refused to fade. "Would you mind sitting with me for a while?" Lila asked, placing the tray on the table. David looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, but he didn't object. He gave a slight nod, and Lila sat across from him, carefully pouring tea into 2 white porcelain cups. The silence stretched on. Lila could sense David's guarded demeanor, but she didn't rush. "Do you ever think that Mr. Robert is still waiting for you?" Lila asked, breaking the stillness. David gazed at her for a long moment, his sharp eyes revealing a deep sadness beneath their surface. My father made decisions, and my mother paid the price for them, he replied, his voice rough. David's words confirmed everything Lila had heard from Martin in the old letter Robert had written, but she knew this wasn't the time to interrupt or pass judgment. David turned the teacup in his hands, his eyes fixed on the rising steam, as if the movement made it easier for him to speak. I once admired my father greatly, he began softly, his voice almost a whisper. As a child, I thought he was the strongest man alive, someone nothing could shake. But after my mother died, everything changed. He paused, drawing a deep breath before continuing. That night, my mother cried. She wanted my father to stop, to spend more time with us. But he told her she was overreacting. They argued, loudly. In the end, she left. And on that forest road, David's words trailed off, lodging in his throat. Lila could see his hand tighten around the teacup, as if grounding himself from breaking apart. The accident happened, she was gone, and my father, he didn't fall apart like I thought he would. Instead, he just kept living, kept working, as if nothing had happened. Lila remained quiet, letting David speak without interruption. She knew this was the first time he had voiced these thoughts, each word peeling back the wounds he had hidden for years. My father drove her down that road. He chose his career over his family. How can I forgive that? David asked, lifting his gaze to meet Lila's, as if searching for an answer she might hold. Lila took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. You know, she said softly, I don't think your father wasn't in pain. I don't believe he continued living as if nothing had happened. Maybe he just didn't know how to show it. Or maybe he was afraid that if he stopped, he'd never be able to stand back up again. David said nothing, his eyes returning to the teacup in his hand. The letter I found, Lila continued, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. He wrote it for you, but he never sent it. I believe he's wanted to apologize for a long time, but he couldn't find the courage to do so. David remained silent for a long while, his breathing slowing. What if one day Mr. Robert wakes up and wants to tell you he's sorry? Lila asked, her eyes full of sincerity. Would you wait for that day, or would you let the chance slip away? David gave a slight shake of his head, as if rejecting the idea, but he said nothing. Lila knew she had touched something buried deep within him. Finally, David's grip loosened, and he set the teacup down, leaning back into the chair. He didn't look at Lila, but his words, though soft, carried weight. Maybe. I need time to think. Lila smiled gently. She didn't need an immediate answer. She just needed to know that for the first time in years, David was willing to face his emotions. Outside, the pale moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the quiet living room. Slowly but surely, the wall between David and his father had begun to crack. Part 4. Light from the darkness. The next morning, the Carter mansion remained shrouded in the thin mist of winter. Lila was arranging medical supplies in Robert's room when the door gently creaked open. David stood there, silent and hesitant. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if he was torn between stepping inside or walking away. But something seemed to push him forward, and David slowly approached his father's bed. Lila remained quietly behind him, keeping enough distance not to disrupt this rare moment. David gazed at Robert, the father he hadn't faced in years. The wrinkles on Robert's face appeared deeper under the dim morning light. The machines beside the bed beeped rhythmically, like a fragile thread connecting Robert to the world. David said nothing. He lowered his head and placed his hand on his father's cold, aged one, a small gesture, yet heavy with emotion. Robert didn't respond, but Lila noticed David held his father's hand for a long time, his eyes gently closed, as if suppressing the surge of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. When David left the room, Lila met his gaze, her eyes warm and understanding. Thank you for doing that, she said softly. David only nodded without a word. But Lila knew his silence was no longer as cold as before. From that day on, David began spending more time by his father's side. At first, he simply sat in the room, silently reading or observing Robert. Gradually, with Lila's guidance, David learned to talk to his father, even if there was no reply. Even if he can't respond, I believe he can still hear you, Lila said, placing a book in David's hand. David started reading to his father, classic novels Robert had once loved, stories filled with nostalgia from the past. Occasionally, Lila played classical music, melodies Evelyn once adored. Each time, David sat quietly beside his father, listening, gazing distantly as if recalling the days when their family was still whole. The more time David spent with Robert, the more Lila noticed a shift in him. His smile appeared more frequently, and his eyes, once filled with sorrow, now carried a hint of relief. With each passing day, I feel closer to him, David admitted one afternoon as they read together in Robert's room. Lila smiled. That's because you've allowed yourself to open your heart. After the evening care routine, David and Lila often sat together in the living room, where the fireplace's warm glow offered comfort against the cold winter nights. Their conversations stretched beyond Robert, touching on life, family, and David's childhood memories. My mother was always the bridge between me and my father, David shared one evening. When she passed, I felt like there was no one left to hold us together. Lila looked at him, her gaze gentle. But now you're doing that. You're the one rebuilding that connection, she replied, her voice soft like a breeze. David gave a faint smile, rare but genuine. One night, Lila caught a mild cold. She tried to hide it, but David quickly noticed the fatigue on her face. Without saying a word, he left the room and returned with a cup of ginger tea and some medicine. You should rest, David said, concern evident in his eyes. Lila smiled lightly, accepting the tea. I'm the nurse, not the patient. But even nurses need to be cared for, David replied. That night, Lila woke in the middle of the night to find David asleep on the chair beside her bed. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast soft shadows on his face. A strange yet comforting warmth filled her heart. Quietly, Lila pulled a thin blanket over him, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. At that moment, Lila realized something special was forming between them, a bond born from pain and healing. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, David woke to the smell of breakfast from the kitchen. You fell asleep in the chair all night, Lila teased with a smile as David walked in. David rubbed the back of his head, his expression slightly embarrassed. I meant to stay just for a bit, but I guess I dozed off. Lila handed him a cup of hot coffee. Thank you for staying, she said sincerely. David held the cup, his eyes soft as they met hers. I think someone reminded me that sometimes we all need someone by our side, David replied, his gaze never leaving Lila. In that moment, they both understood. They were no longer strangers. Amidst a mansion once cloaked in shadows, the light of understanding and affection was beginning to spread. Part 5. The Turning Point. Mr. Robert wakes up. The winter sun had just begun to rise, its soft rays slipping through the large windows, casting a golden hue over Mr. Robert's quiet room. The atmosphere remained still as ever, with only the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filling the space. David sat by his father's bedside, an open book resting in his lap, though his eyes were not on the pages. Instead, he gazed at his father, his eyes heavy with sorrow, but no longer distant. You know, Dad, I used to love hearing Mom talk about your travels together, David said softly, his voice laced with warmth and nostalgia. She said you were the strongest man she had ever met. But I think what I admired most was how much you loved her. A faint smile crossed his lips, though it carried the weight of lingering pain. I was angry with you for so long, but maybe I forgot that you lost Mom too. David reached out, gently holding his father's cold hand. Robert's hand lay limp, showing no sign of conscious life. Suddenly, Robert's finger twitched. David froze, his heart skipping a beat. His eyes locked onto his father's hand, afraid that what he saw was nothing more than a trick of his imagination. But no, Robert's finger moved again, this time more distinctly. Lila, David called out, his voice trembling with excitement. In an instant, Layla rushed into the room. She looked at David, then down at Robert. David held his father's hand tightly, his voice cracking. Dad, can you hear me? Robert's eyelashes fluttered slightly, and his eyes slowly opened. The soft morning light caused him to squint, but as his gaze met David's, recognition flickered in his tired eyes. David! Robert's voice was faint but clear. The entire room seemed to pause in that moment. Lila covered her mouth, holding back tears, while David sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what he had just heard. David lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. He gripped his father's hand tighter, as if afraid that letting go would send Robert back into an endless slumber. "I'm here, Dad. I'm sorry for staying away so long," David choked out, his voice breaking with emotion. Robert's hand weakly tightened around his son's, frail but filled with the warmth David had longed for. I, I'm sorry," Robert whispered, his fragile voice trembling with the weight of years of unspoken regrets. In that moment, all the distance, resentment, and pain from the past seemed to dissolve. Lila quietly stepped out, leaving the room for the father and son to share this intimate reconciliation. Standing in the hallway, she gently closed the door, but through the gap she could still hear David's soft murmurs. As Lila descended the staircase, the morning light streamed through the mansion's windows, bathing the Carter estate in an unusual warmth. The atmosphere shifted, as if the house itself was beginning to thaw from the cold that had gripped it for so long. She glanced up at the large clock hanging on the wall. Time continued to move forward, but she knew that today was different. A day of change, not only for Robert and David, but also for herself. For the first time since arriving at the Carter mansion, Lila felt that this place was no longer cold and lifeless. It was beginning to breathe again, to come alive, thanks to the forgiveness and love that had begun to heal old wounds. Part 6, The End. A New Family. Time passed and Robert Carter had almost fully recovered. Under the warm spring sun, he often strolled through the garden with David and Lila, where the flowers Evelyn had once planted bloomed vibrantly, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. With each passing day, Robert felt the shift in his relationship with David. The distance between them had dissolved, and the Carter estate was now filled with light and laughter, things that had been absent for many years. "Thank you for coming back, David," Robert said as the two of them sat on a wooden bench by the flower beds. David looked at his father, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We shouldn't waste any more time, Dad." David and Lila's bond deepened with each day they spent caring for Robert. Long evenings by the fire, conversations that lingered in the garden. All of it breathed new hope into their hearts. One summer evening, David invited Lila to a special dinner in the estate's garden. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a romantic glow, David took Lila's hand and softly said, "Lila, you haven't just cared for my father. You've mended my heart. I want you by my side. Not just tonight, but forever." Lila smiled gently, her eyes shimmering. "I want that too, David." A year later on Evelyn's birthday, David planned a small ceremony in the garden, a place his mother had cherished. As dusk fell and the garden lit up with twinkling lights, David knelt before Lila, holding the Carter family's heirloom ring. "Lila, you've brought happiness back to this place, and to my life. Will you marry me?" David's voice trembled slightly, but his eyes gleamed with hope. Overwhelmed, Lila couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. Today, the Carter estate was more vibrant than ever. The garden overflowed with blossoms, preparing for David and Lila's wedding. Red roses, Evelyn's favorite, lined the stone pathway leading to the altar, where David stood, his eyes full of anticipation. As Lila stepped out in a pristine white gown, David couldn't take his eyes off her. She moved gracefully toward him, each step blending with the dreamlike surroundings. Robert, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, sat in the front row, his eyes brimming with pride and emotion. When David took Lila's hand, Robert rose slowly and made his way to officiate the ceremony. "It's a great blessing that today I am not only witnessing my son's wedding," Robert said, his voice trembling but warm, "but I am also welcoming Lila, the woman who has brought light and healing to my family." He turned to Lila, his eyes reflecting profound gratitude. "Lila, thank you. Thank you for not giving up on David and for bringing my son back to me." Lila bowed her head, too moved to speak. David squeezed her hand, whispering in her ear, "My father is right. Without you, this family wouldn't have healed." As David placed the ring on Lila's finger, Robert quietly wiped away a tear. In that moment, it felt as though Evelyn's spirit was present, smiling as she watched her family's happiness unfold. After the ceremony, everyone gathered in the garden for a small reception. Robert raised his glass, his gaze fixed on David and Lila. "This is not just a wedding, it is the beginning of a new family," he said, "a family Evelyn always dreamed of. And David, you found someone you truly love." David stood, wrapping an arm around Lila's waist, smiling at his father. "I think Mom is smiling somewhere, Dad." Robert nodded, his eyes glistening. She'd be proud. Later that evening, after the guests had left, David and Lila sat beneath the old oak tree in the garden. The delicate glow of string lights danced around them, and in the peaceful air, David gently kissed Lila's hand. "Welcome to the family," he whispered. Lila rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of love and the deep bond they had built together. Forgiveness is the key to healing even the deepest wounds. Love is not just a flame that warms the heart, but a force that helps people overcome loss and rediscover peace. Sometimes the presence of one person can transform an entire family, turning scars into beautiful memories and opening the door to a new journey filled with love and hope. Thank you for following our story. How would you rate this tale from 1 to 10? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Your feedback means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this story with others.